I sometimes wonder if happiness is just the silent period before everything falls apart. They say ignorance is bliss, and I was blissfully ignorant of what was happening right under my own roof, in my own home, with the two people I loved and trusted most in this world. My name is Nathan Turner, and this is the story of how my perfectly constructed life crumbled into dust. It's not easy to tell, but maybe sharing my experience will help someone else recognize what I was too blind to see. Maybe it'll help you hold on to what matters before it slips away. Or maybe, just maybe, it'll help you rebuild when everything you thought was solid turns to sand beneath your feet. 7 years ago, I thought I'd finally gotten it right. My first marriage to Ethan's mother had ended painfully after 10 years. She'd fallen out of love, wanted different things, the usual story. I threw myself into my work after that, climbing the ladder at my architecture firm in Denver, focusing on being the best weekend dad I could be to my son. I wasn't expecting to find love again, certainly not with Vanessa. She waltzed into my life at a charity function, this vibrant yoga instructor with an infectious laugh, who somehow found my detailed explanations of sustainable building materials fascinating. Or at least she pretended to. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Within a year we were married, settling into our craftsman home in one of Denver's picturesque suburbs. I remember thinking how perfectly everything fit. Her collection of plants thriving in the sunroom I'd designed, my architectural drawings spread across the home office, our shared love of quiet Sunday mornings with coffee on the porch overlooking the mountains. We complemented each other. I was methodical, detail-oriented. She was spontaneous and brought color into my structured world. Of course, marriage isn't just about the honeymoon period. Over time, we settled into comfortable routines. I worked long hours as I moved toward partnership at the firm. Vanessa taught her yoga classes, maintained our social calendar, and kept our home life running smoothly. We weren't passionate teenagers anymore, but I thought we had something solid, something real, something built to last. That's what I told myself anyway. Everything changed when Ethan graduated college last year. He'd earned his business degree but was struggling to find work in his field. When he asked if he could move back home temporarily while job hunting in Denver, I was thrilled. I'd missed having him around more regularly, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to strengthen our bond while he transitioned to adulthood. I still remember the day he moved in, his beat-up Honda packed to the ceiling with boxes. Vanessa had prepared his favorite lasagna as a welcome home dinner. We sat around the table that night, drinking wine, laughing at Ethan's college stories. I remember looking across at my wife and son, thinking, this is what happiness feels like. I remember feeling so grateful that they got along, that we could be this harmonious blended family. God, I was blind. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. Ethan would apply for jobs during the day, and I'd help review his resume in the evenings. Vanessa went out of her way to make him feel welcome, showing him the best running trails in the neighborhood, introducing him to her younger friends. I was busy at work, finalizing a major commercial project downtown, often coming home late to find them watching a movie or playing cards at the kitchen table. I was grateful they'd bonded. That's the word I used, bonded. I had no idea their connection was becoming something else entirely. Looking back, I can pinpoint when things began to change, though I didn't recognize it at the time. About a month after Ethan moved in, Vanessa became different. Distant one moment, overly affectionate the next. She started taking more care with her appearance around the house. No more lounging in old sweats, suddenly always wearing makeup, even on her days off. I assumed she was just going through one of her periodic self-improvement phases. She'd done similar things before, suddenly getting into meditation, or clean eating, or training for a half marathon. This just seemed like another Vanessa phase. Then the excuses started. She began declining date nights, claiming exhaustion from adding more yoga classes to her schedule. Our intimate life grew increasingly sporadic. When I'd reach for her at night, she'd murmur about early morning clients or a headache. I told myself it was just a temporary rough patch. All marriages have them. The first time I felt that twist in my gut, that primitive instinct warning you something's wrong, was innocent enough. I called Vanessa from work one afternoon to ask if she needed anything from the grocery store. I clearly heard Ethan's distinctive music playing in the background, that indie folk stuff he was always listening to. "Just stopping by to grab my yoga mat," she explained casually. But I'd seen her mat in her car that morning, when I'd kissed her goodbye. Such a small thing. But it was the first loose thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything I believed about my life. After that, I couldn't help noticing other inconsistencies. Vanessa would mention running errands, but Ethan would later reference seeing her at home during those times. I'd walk into the kitchen to find them standing slightly too close, conversations dying abruptly. Once, I noticed Ethan's hand lingering on her shoulder a beat too long. Each time, I'd silence the alarm bells in my head. "He's my son. She's my wife. You're being paranoid, Nathan." Our wedding anniversary fell on a Thursday that year. 7 years together. I decided to surprise her by coming home early. Dinner reservations already made at that upscale place downtown she'd been wanting to try. I'd even stopped for flowers. Tulips, her favorite. But when I arrived home mid-afternoon, the house was empty. Vanessa had told me she'd be teaching back-to-back yoga classes until 6. A quick call to the studio confirmed what I already suspected. She wasn't on the schedule that day at all. I sat in our kitchen for over an hour, staring at those tulips, my mind spinning increasingly dark scenarios. When I heard her key in the lock, I watched her face transition from surprise to something resembling guilt before she composed herself. "Nathan, you're home early." Her voice was too bright, too cheerful. When I asked where she'd been, she claimed she'd gone hiking to clear her head after her last class was canceled. Her hair was perfectly styled, not at all like someone who'd been on a trail. She was wearing one of her nicer outfits, light makeup carefully applied. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe her. But the gnawing feeling in my stomach wouldn't subside. That night at the restaurant, seated across from my beautiful wife as she opened the anniversary gift I'd carefully selected months before, a delicate silver bracelet with coordinates engraved for the spot where we'd first met, I found myself studying her like a stranger. Who was this woman, really? Was I just being insecure? Paranoid? Or was something happening that would destroy everything I thought we had? Another week passed. The uneasiness grew. I began noticing how Vanessa's eyes would automatically track Ethan when he entered a room. How my son seemed to find endless excuses to be wherever she was. The casual touches that didn't seem casual at all. One morning, I discovered Ethan's sweatshirt folded neatly with Vanessa's laundry. When I mentioned it, she became flustered, saying she'd found it in the dryer and was just being helpful. Maybe that was true. Maybe everything had an innocent explanation. But I couldn't silence the doubts anymore. After a neighborhood home was broken into, I suggested installing security cameras, one by the front door, one covering the back patio, and one in the main living area. "For safety," I explained. Vanessa seemed hesitant but eventually agreed. The system linked to my phone, allowing me to check footage remotely. For several days, everything seemed normal. I began to think I'd imagined the whole thing, that I was projecting some midlife insecurity onto my wife and son's innocent relationship. Then came the day that divided my life into before and after. I was at the office, buried in permit applications, when my phone pinged with a motion alert from the living room camera. It was Tuesday afternoon, a time when the house should have been empty. Vanessa had mentioned a lunch date with friends followed by errands. Ethan was supposedly at a job interview downtown. Curious, I opened the app. There they were, my wife and my son, entering the living room together, laughing about something. Nothing alarming yet, just two people who weren't supposed to be home. I was about to close the app when Ethan reached for her, pulling Vanessa close in a way that instantly made my blood run cold. This wasn't a family embrace. Their kiss was passionate, familiar, practiced. They moved together with the easy intimacy of lovers well acquainted with each other's bodies. I watched, paralyzed, as they sank onto the couch. The couch where we'd opened Christmas presents as a family, where Ethan and I had watched countless Broncos games together. My hands shook so violently I dropped the phone. I remember thinking how bizarre it was that the world kept spinning when mine had just shattered completely. The office noises continued around me. Phones ringing, colleagues discussing project details, the coffee machine gurgling in the break room. Didn't they realize that everything had just changed? That I'd just witnessed the two people I loved most in this world destroying me together? I picked up my phone and forced myself to watch more, needing incontrovertible evidence before I confronted them. They were completely uninhibited, clearly comfortable in their betrayal, taking the intimacy further right there in our family home. At one point, Vanessa looked directly at the camera, and for a horrifying moment I thought she'd realized they were being recorded. But she was just glancing at the clock, mentioning that they had plenty of time before he gets home. The casual way she referenced me, not as her husband, not as Ethan's father, just an inconvenience to work around, that's what broke me. That's when the shock gave way to a rage so pure it frightened me. Have you ever experienced that moment when everything you believed about your life shatters in an instant? That feeling of the ground disappearing beneath your feet? If you have, my heart goes out to you. It's a unique kind of pain, realizing that your reality has been a carefully constructed illusion. If you're going through something similar right now, know that you're not alone. The comment section below is a place to share these broken moments, these turning points. Sometimes just knowing others have survived what feels unsurvivable can be the tiny handhold we need to keep from falling completely. I closed the app and sat motionless at my desk for what must have been hours. Colleagues stopped by, concerned by my ashen face, but I waved them off with mumbled excuses about food poisoning. By the time I left the office, I had a plan. I would not confront them immediately, not while anger clouded my judgment. I needed them to know that I knew. I needed to see their faces when their secret world collapsed. I stopped at a liquor store on the way home and bought an expensive bottle of wine, Vanessa's favorite Cabernet. At home, I found her preparing dinner as if it were any normal Tuesday. Ethan was setting the table, the perfect, helpful son. I watched them carefully, noting the subtle glances, the careful way they maintained appropriate distance in my presence. The performance was impressive. How long had they been deceiving me like this? Weeks? Months? Let's open this with dinner, I suggested, presenting the wine. I'm feeling celebratory tonight. What are we celebrating? Vanessa asked, her smile genuine. That was perhaps the most disturbing part. How normal everything felt. How skillfully they maintained the facade. Truth, I said simply, uncorking the bottle. I think we should toast to truth tonight. If they detected anything strange in my manner, neither showed it. We sat down to eat, making mundane small talk about Ethan's fictional job interview and Vanessa's fictional lunch with friends. I barely touched my food, watching them perform their roles. Dutiful wife, respectful son, while beneath the table my hands trembled with rage and grief. I waited until they were both midway through their wine before placing my phone in the center of the table, the damning video queued up and ready to play. I'd like us all to watch something together, I said quietly. The color drained from Vanessa's face instantly. She knew. Ethan looked confused until I pressed play, and the sounds of their afternoon tryst filled our dining room. I watched their expressions transform, not with shock at being accused, but with shock at being caught. There was a moment of complete silence when the video ended, a terrible suspended moment where we all sat frozen in the death of our family. How could you? I finally managed. my voice barely a whisper. That was all I could trust myself to say. Ethan actually had the nerve to reach for an explanation. "Dad, it just happened. We didn't plan this. It just happened?" My laugh sounded foreign to my own ears. Like tripping on a sidewalk? Like getting caught in the rain? No. Affairs don't just happen. They're built on 1,000 tiny choices, each one a deliberate step away from decency, away from the people who love you. Each one a choice to betray, to destroy. Vanessa began crying, those practiced tears she could summon at will during any argument. "Nathan, please, we need to talk about this. It's complicated. I still love—" "Don't." I cut her off. "Don't you dare say you love me. Not now. Not after I watched you with my son on the couch where we built our life together." What followed was a blur of accusations, explanations, and justifications. Ethan swinging between defiance, claiming their feelings were real, and stammering apologies that meant nothing. Vanessa oscillating between tearful remorse and defensive anger, as if somehow I had driven her to this ultimate betrayal. I listened to it all with a strange detachment, as if watching a particularly distasteful movie involving characters I used to know. "I want you both out of my house tonight," I finally said, interrupting their tangled explanations. "I don't care where you go. I don't care what happens to either of you anymore." "Dad, be reasonable," Ethan started, but I silenced him with a look that must have communicated the full extent of my disgust. "You are not my son tonight," I told him, each word precise and weighted. "And you," I turned to Vanessa, "are not my wife. Not in any way that matters. You have 1 hour. Then I'm changing the locks." I walked out of the house and sat in my car, watching through the windshield as they hurriedly packed bags. They left separately. Some last attempt at dignity, I suppose. Neither looked back at the house, at the life we'd built, that they had so thoroughly burned to the ground. I sat there for hours after they'd gone, unable to re-enter the home that now felt contaminated by their betrayal. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. I took leave from work, unable to focus on architectural details when my personal foundation had completely collapsed. I alternated between rage so intense I put my fist through a wall and a hollow emptiness that felt like dying. I drank too much, slept too little. Friends called, concerned about my sudden disappearance from social life, but I couldn't bear to explain what had happened. How do you tell people that your wife and son were sleeping together? The humiliation was as devastating as the betrayal. The first person I finally confided in was Michelle, a colleague from the firm who stopped by unannounced with food after I'd missed 2 weeks of work. She found me unshaven, the house a mess, half-empty bottles scattered across countertops. I expected disgust or awkward pity when I finally told her everything. Instead, she listened without judgment, then quietly began picking up around the house. "This isn't something you have to face alone," she said simply. Those words, so basic, so fundamental, somehow penetrated the fog I'd been living in. Not because I harbored any romantic notions about Michelle, but because her basic human kindness reminded me that the world wasn't entirely composed of betrayal and pain. That night, I poured the remaining alcohol down the drain and made an appointment with a therapist. I'm not going to pretend recovery was linear or easy. Some days I'd feel almost normal, only to be ambushed by memories that would send me spiraling again. Driving past Vanessa's favorite restaurant, finding one of Ethan's old textbooks on a shelf. The therapy sessions helped, though at first I could barely articulate the unique pain of this particular betrayal. The dual loss, the compound fracture of trust. "What hurts more?" my therapist asked once. "Your wife's infidelity, or that it was with your son?" "They're inseparable," I answered after long consideration. "It's like asking which blade of the scissors cut you." I think the lowest point came about 3 months after they left. I'd returned to work, was going through the motions of recovery, when I received divorce papers from Vanessa's lawyer. Included was a note requesting certain items from the house: her grandmother's mirror, her collection of first edition books, the expensive yoga equipment I'd given her for her birthday. The clinical detachment of it, the reduction of our 7 years together to a list of possessions to be divided, broke something in me that had somehow remained intact through everything else. That night I found myself sitting in my car outside the apartment they'd rented together across town, watching their shadows move behind closed blinds, torturing myself with images of their new life built on the ruins of mine. How long I sat there I couldn't say. But I remember the moment clarity returned, the sudden, sickening realization that I was allowing them to destroy not just my past, but my present and future as well. That by fixating on their betrayal, I was keeping myself chained to it. Have you ever found yourself stuck in that dark place, where pain becomes almost comfortable because it's familiar? Where moving forward feels impossible because it means letting go of even the negative connection to people who hurt you? I spent months in that limbo, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. If my story resonates with you, if you're struggling to find your way forward after betrayal changed everything, please know there is a path through this darkness. Share your experience in the comments if it helps to know others understand, or just to release those thoughts that keep you awake at night. 6 months after the confrontation, an envelope arrived with Vanessa's handwriting on it. Not forwarded through lawyers, addressed directly to me. I almost burned it unopened. Instead, I brought it to my next therapy session, where I finally found the courage to read it. The letter was unexpectedly honest. She and Ethan had separated. Their relationship had collapsed under the weight of guilt and mutual resentment. She wrote about how what had begun as an inappropriate flirtation during a vulnerable time had spiraled into an addiction of sorts. The forbidden nature of their connection creating an intensity that wasn't sustainable in the harsh light of reality. She expressed profound regret, but to her credit, didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. She simply wanted me to know that she recognized the depth of her betrayal and was seeking help to understand why she had been capable of causing such pain. "I don't expect this to change anything," she wrote toward the end. "I just need you to know that I understand now what I've done to you, to us, to the family we had. And I am truly sorry, Nathan. Not because I got caught, but because I never should have allowed it to happen at all." I didn't respond to the letter. I wasn't ready for any communication with either of them. But something shifted in me afterward. My therapist suggested that perhaps I'd been waiting for some acknowledgement of the magnitude of their betrayal. Not to erase it, but to confirm that I hadn't imagined its enormity. Vanessa's letter, with its lack of excuses, had inadvertently given me permission to stop obsessing over why it had happened and start focusing on what came next. Gradually, I began rebuilding. I reconnected with old friends, particularly Thomas, my oldest friend from childhood, who had known me through my first divorce and never stopped checking in, despite my periods of self-isolation. I joined a support group for people dealing with infidelity, though my situation was unique enough that I had to modify details when sharing. I sold the house, unable to live with its memories, and channeled my architectural training into designing myself a small, modern cabin outside the city, something entirely mine, untouched by the past. Almost a year to the day after the confrontation, Ethan reached out by email, asking to meet. My immediate impulse was to refuse, to maintain the wall of silence I'd built between myself and my former family. My therapist neither encouraged nor discouraged the meeting, but suggested I consider what I hoped to gain from it: closure, answers, reconciliation, or something else entirely. After much consideration, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, public enough to discourage dramatic scenes. Seeing him walk through the door was harder than I'd anticipated. Despite everything, this was still the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager whose broken heart I'd helped mend after his first girlfriend cheated on him, The irony of that memory was not lost on me. But he wasn't that boy anymore. The young man who sat across from me looked diminished somehow, carrying the weight of consequences, perhaps for the first time in his life. "Thank you for coming," he began awkwardly, staring into his untouched coffee. I said nothing, waiting. This meeting wasn't for my benefit. He had requested it. Let him do the work. "I've been in therapy," he continued after the silence stretched uncomfortably, "trying to understand why I did what I did. To you. To us." He looked up then, his eyes, so like mine, filled with unshed tears. "Dad, I'm not here for apologies," I interrupted, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I don't think there are words for what happened." "Then why did you agree to meet?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly in the days leading up to this meeting. Closure, maybe, or just to see if there's anything left between us worth salvaging. I honestly don't know. What followed was perhaps the most honest conversation I'd ever had with my adult son. He spoke about his confused feelings returning home after college, the attention from Vanessa that had initially seemed innocent until it wasn't, the intoxication of the forbidden that had overcome any moral considerations. He didn't make excuses, which I appreciated. He owned his choices and their devastating consequences. "I lost everything that mattered," he said at one point. "My father, my self-respect, my sense of who I was. Turns out, when you betray your foundations like that, there's nothing solid left to stand on." Sitting across from my son at that coffee shop, seeing the boy I'd raised now a broken man, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. I wasn't there yet. But I realized I'd been letting their betrayal define every moment of my life since. My therapist had asked me once, "Who are you besides a betrayed husband and father?" I couldn't answer then. Now I could. I was a survivor. I was the architect of my own rebuilding, and that was a foundation no one could take from me again. "I can't promise anything," I told Ethan as our meeting concluded, "but I'm willing to see where this goes. Small steps. Separate from Vanessa." He nodded, understanding the boundary I was setting. "That's more than I deserve," he said quietly. If you've ever had to rebuild a relationship after profound betrayal, you know how complicated this journey can be. The path to healing is rarely straightforward, and forgiveness, if it comes at all, isn't a single moment but a process that unfolds in its own time. I'd love to hear how you've navigated similar challenges in your own life. Has rebuilding been possible for you? What helped you move forward? Sharing our stories can be a powerful way to find community in these isolating experiences. That was 8 months ago. Today, I'm cautiously rebuilding a relationship with my son. Not the same as before, but something new that acknowledges our painful history while not being defined by it. Ethan and I meet periodically for hiking or coffee, carefully avoiding topics that might reopen old wounds. We're feeling our way forward, step by uncertain step. As for Vanessa, we communicate only through lawyers. Some betrayals cut too deep for direct contact. Some boundaries need to remain firm for healing to continue. My cabin is nearly complete now, a physical manifestation of my recovery. Floor-to-ceiling windows face the mountains, reminding me daily that there are vistas beyond my pain, horizons I have yet to explore. I've started dating again recently, cautiously. Michelle and I have developed a friendship that might be evolving into something more, though we're both careful not to rush. Trust, once shattered, rebuilds slowly. I'm learning to be patient with that process. Do I still have days when anger resurfaces? Of course. Moments when grief ambushes me unexpectedly? Absolutely. But they no longer define me. I've learned that resilience isn't about never falling. It's about continuing to rise each time life knocks you down. It's about rebuilding even when every instinct screams to burn the ruins and walk away. If my story resonates with you, if you've experienced betrayal that felt civilization ending in its magnitude, know this: you will survive it. The life you rebuild may look different than the one you planned, but it can be meaningful, even beautiful in its own way. The scars we carry become part of our strength if we let them, reminders not just of our wounds, but of our capacity to heal. Thank you for listening to my story. If it helped you feel less alone in your own journey, consider subscribing to hear more stories of people who have walked through fire and emerged, changed, but not destroyed. Because that's the truth I've finally come to accept. Betrayal changed me, but it did not destroy me. And in that space between change and destruction, I found the courage to begin again. I am Nathan Turner. And this is not the end of my story, but simply the beginning of a new chapter. One I'm writing myself, one day at a time.